Here are the things that we're going to be talking about in this introductory set of videos here. First of all, and this is probably what most of our time is going to be spent on, is learning how to measure. And I know it sounds incredibly boring, and it is, but it's also super important. That's what science is all based on, is the ability to measure. And there's some really particular, very specific rules that we're going to use. And by the way, we're going to develop this throughout the term. A lot of this stuff is going to be a little hazy at first, and then get a little better later. We're going to have a video having to do with accuracy versus precision, and you'll be able to hopefully watch my wife playing darts, which is definitely worth it. 3 is we're going to talk about significant figures, including some rules, and then how to calculate with significant figures. So those are the 3 videos, and as I said, I kind of do each one in turn. There are 2 parts to this particular lab. I would definitely, before I really started to tackle either one of those parts, I would definitely watch all of these videos, and feel free to ask in Canvas office hours if you have any questions, because you should have some. The first thing we need to understand in order to make measurements is how to even do the measurements before we can start talking about the results of those measurements. So keep in mind that when you measure something, the one most important thing is the increment. And most of you probably know what I'm talking about when I say increment, but when you look at a measuring device, and it's probably easiest to think about a ruler, you have certain lines obviously on that ruler that allow you to do the measurement. The increment is the space between the smallest 2 lines, and I have a couple of examples of different increments on there. And it turns out that these measuring rules, we use 2 different measuring rules. One is what I call the rule of tens, or ones, I guess we could also call it. The other one is the rule of 2s and 5s. So we're going to go through a couple of examples, and the best thing that we can do is just to watch me do the measurements. So what I did was I took mug shots of a couple of my, I guess we'd call them disturbing minifigs that I like to have here with me because it makes me feel like I have a class. So you're going to see 2 of my favorite minifigs. Okay, so here's a visual way of keeping in mind that we're always going to look at the increment. The first thing that I'm going to show you is the rule of tens, and then we're going to move on to the rule of 2s and 5s. The rule of tens is, I would say, probably the most common kind of rule that we're going to be using, but it's still important that we know how to do this because we do occasionally find things like thermometers and other things that are probably in your lab kit that are all have increments in 2s and 5s. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video and I'll post kind of like a picture in a picture probably right here somewhere, and we'll start to actually measure some of these little disturbing minifigs. If all's working properly, somewhere around here you should see a picture of Clyde. Clyde's got some problems obviously, but be nice to him. He cries really easily. And one of the things you'll notice is that the ruler that we're using to measure him in the mugshot has an increment of exactly 1. In other words, each time you see a line, right, there is an increase by 1. So what I like to do before I make a measurement is I write down my increment. So an increment of 1, we should probably put units on here. Let's just call them Breslins or something like that, right? So we're in increments of 1 Breslin. We'll pretend that's a measurement of length or something, right? So 1 Breslin, that increment of 1 means that I am in the rule of tens, right? And I guess I shouldn't call it the rule of tens, but it basically means anything that is like 1, 10, 100 units of 0.1, 0.01, 0.001. Do you want me to go on? That's where we're going to be using the rule of tens. All I mean is that they're all exponents of 10. So anytime you've got an increment of 1, the rule of tens tells us what we have to do is that we find kind of the last mark that's on there, and that's called the known number, right? And then we're going to estimate one additional digit, right? And so in other words, every single measurement that we make is going to be some number, blah, 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 whatever that number happens to be, dot, and then one more digit after it, right? And so let me show you what that's going to look like for measuring Clyde over here. So hopefully you can still see the picture right there. And what we're going to see is that the last line was 2, right? So we're going to record this thing as 2, right? The increment, notice, is in the ones place, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? Those are all in the ones place. So we record whatever that measurement is in the ones place, and that's our last kind of known number. In other words, kind of the number we can all agree on. Now this next digit right here, and I can only do one, and that's the whole point of this, right? Is I can only do one more number, and I have to kind of decide, okay, is it like halfway to the next increment? Is it, maybe like almost halfway? Is it, a quarter of the way? You get the idea, and I'm only allowed to do one more digit here. So let me take another look at Clyde and figure out approximately what that number looks like to me. So looking at Clyde, I decided that he was about halfway in between the 2 or the 3, so I put a 0.5 there. And so this is what's called an estimated digit, right? One of you might look at it and say, oh, no, you're an idiot, right? It's obviously a 4, right? A 0.4. And other people might say, it's a 0.6. But the idea is that we're just kind of estimating and using our kind of our approximating ability to come up with that number. But the important thing to recognize is that I have to include that what's called the tenths place, right? If I include anything more, right? If I started to put more numbers out here, that would include way too much precision giving our measuring instrument. And all of these measurement rules have everything to do with what's called precision, which we'll talk about in a whole bunch more in another video. But you have to make sure that you indicate precision correctly. So when I look at this number, right, as a scientist, I look at this and I kind of have some idea of how precise the instrument was that was used to collect it. Other measured numbers, right, if we were sending, I don't know, if Clyde was going to the moon and we had to make like a spacesuit for Clyde, this may not be enough precision, right? We may need a much better idea of how tall Clyde is, right? And then I would use a much more precise instrument that had a whole bunch more little tiny lines, right? And I might end up with some other number that was like 2.496579, blah, 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 right? But that would tell me, right, that I used a really, really precise instrument. Whereas like, if I just had like a 2 here or something like that, that doesn't indicate enough precision, right? Precision costs money, right? And effort. So like if I just put a 2 there, I'm kind of throwing away all that extra effort. So numbers are really trying to communicate something when we measure them. Okay, next opportunity to do some measurement on Clyde. There's another picture of Clyde, and I'll try to keep that up there. And I want you to figure out what the increment is. Look at the space between the smallest lines on that thing. What you should notice is that the increment now, by the way, I stands for increment obviously, is 0.1, right? So that is a power of 10. So we're in the rule of tens. And what we're going to do is anything that we record with that device is we're going to have that increment right there, in other words, the tenths place, plus one additional place, which is called the hundredths place, right? So now this is going to be an estimated digit, and that thing is considered the known digit. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, I'm looking at Clyde there, and I see a 2.4, right? He's not quite to the 2.5. It looks like he reaches to the 2.4. And now it's up to me to decide, is he like, how far past that 4 is he, right? What is my estimated digit going to be? And so I just kind of decided that that looked like a 2 to me, right? It looks like it's about, a 2/10 or a fifth of the way there. So we're going to call that 2.42 Breslins. Right? And so again, notice that I now have another digit in there. So that means that I'm using a more precise instrument. Does that make sense? Well, yeah, it's got more lines on it, right? And keep in mind, as you're going to see soon, is this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with accuracy. You can have, super imprecise instruments that are considered accurate. You can have super precise instruments that are incredibly inaccurate. So that's going to be another discussion. All we're talking about here is how to properly use a device to actually measure something. So let's try another example, but what we're going to do instead of using the rule of tens is we're going to switch instead to some place where we would use the rule of 2s and 5s. All right, next disturbing minifig, that's Boy George. So Boy George there, you'll notice that the instrument we're using right now, oh gross, that sounds really bad to say Boy George's instrument. Maybe I should edit that out. Maybe not. So when you look at that thing, you'll notice that the space between those lines is actually an increment of 2. So now we're in a completely different regime, we'll say, right? So if your increment is 2 Breslins, we'll just abbreviate it as BRs here. It turns out that that whole thing where you estimate one additional digit that we saw with the rule of tens, you're not going to do that now. You're not allowed to do that. And I know that's going to drive people crazy, but that's the rule. That's the thing we're stuck with here, right? And so as I'm looking at that, I can see clearly that he is past the 2, right? Boy George is past the 2. And I can also see very clearly that he's not quite to like halfway, right? Which would have been 3. But the thing is that the rule says that I have to stop, right at that particular digit. Whatever the last, I guess, line was, I kind of have to stop at that. Confusingly, if he actually got up to the point where he was right about at 3 or somewhere around there, it's actually okay to write a 3 at that point because you're not adding in an additional a digit of precision, I guess I would say. So it turns out that the correct answer here would be the fact that Boy George is actually 2 Breslin in length. I never want to say that ever again. Next instrument. Next one. What's that increment right there? It's 0.5. You notice that each of those lines increases the value by 0.5, right? So let's write that down. The increment is 0.5. And those of you that are kind of figuring things out, you'll notice that if it's not a 1, you're in the rule of 2s and 5s usually, right? You can see crazy other measurements like 4s and weird stuff like that, but it's pretty rare. Most of the time it's either going to be a 2, a 5, or a 1 power. So this guy is called the rule of 5s right here. And just like we saw before, now we're not allowed to add an additional digit, right? So our measurements will all have what's called the 10th place in them. And to look at that, I already forgot what I looked at. Now we're allowed to record 2 point, whatever number I think that thing might be. Let me take another look. So the properly reported number to me looks like 2.3. Right? It looked like he wasn't quite to that 0.4. Again, it's an estimated digit. So you may look at it and think, oh yeah, it's definitely up to 0.4. Or maybe it's only a 2.2. Again, I can't argue with that. That's, though you're still doing the measurement correctly. Once you start to say like 2.5 and things like that, I'd say, well, it's pretty obvious he's not quite there, but I guess technically that would still be right, just because you're following the rule. So these are the kind of measuring rules we're going to use, especially when you do your at-home lab with that, I think it's called part 2, where you guys go ahead and measure things with either a ruler or the supplied graduated cylinder and things like that. I'm going to try to use a graduated cylinder example in the very next one. And we'll stop, you guys will get to stop looking at mug shots of all of my many, many very strange minifigs. But this will hopefully shed some light on some other situations that you're going to encounter. Okay, there's a measurement in a graduated cylinder that you have to make. I don't necessarily like this image, but it's the one I picked out because I'm silly. And the reason I don't like it is usually when there's some sort of measurement that you make of a volume. So here's my artist's impression of a graduated cylinder. Usually, due to the adhesion at the side of the flask here, usually there's kind of a U. That thing is called a meniscus. Just like the meniscus in your knee kind of makes a U shape. Well, I don't have any meniscus left, but those of you that still have menisci left, that's what it looks like. And the rule is that you always measure to the bottom of the meniscus, and I think one of your write-ups has something about doing that. So hopefully it'll help you out a little bit. No meniscus in this particular image. Well, let's see if we can make some sense out of how we would do that. Again, most important thing is the increment. So I look at that, and what is the space between the smallest lines there? It looks like 1 to me, right? And this is in milliliters, so let's use it. So the increment is exactly 1 milliliter. What rule are we going to use? We're going to use the rule of tens, right? Where we add or estimate 1 additional digit. So I look at that thing and I say, well, it's definitely past the 13, right? But is it, closer to 14 or closer to 13? And I think that it's probably right around 3. I'm going to record it as 13.3, right? Milliliters. So that's a correctly reported measurement. You may disagree with me, right? But as long as whatever number you disagree with me with has only the 10th place and you stop there, I'm happy. Here's an example that we're going to see all the time. Thermometers oftentimes have intervals like this. So the first thing you have to do, by the way, we're going to use degrees Celsius because we're not ruffians that use degrees Fahrenheit. By the way, that's one of the reasons my dad thinks I'm a member of the KGB, is because I constantly am using the metric system and it drives him crazy. He thinks I'm a communist. Anyway, we're going to use degrees Celsius. When you look at that interval, we're not in calculus class, thank God. You look at the smallest line between those divisions, and what you'll find is that the increment is actually 2. Right? So 2 degrees for every single one of those little increments gives rise to the fact that, when you count up 5 of them, it goes from 10 to 20, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what that means is whatever value that I report, because this is in the rule of 2s and 5s, it means that I have to stop at the 1s place in my recording the temperature. So I look at that and it kind of looks to me like it's between 19 and 20. You may disagree, but I'm sorry, between 18 and 20. So because it's between 18 and 20, I'm going to say that the value is 19 degrees Celsius. Right? Again, that's following the rule properly. I'm ending at the 1s place, right? So this thing is properly reported. If I were to say point something, that would be too precise. If I didn't do that, and let's say just recorded 20 degrees Celsius, it turns out that that is kind of in a no man's land, because are you saying that it's 20 with a dot next to it, right? Which actually is the proper way of reporting that, as if you think that's actually 20, you have to use that little dot there. I know, we'll get to that when we start talking about sig figs. But without the dot there, you may be using a very imprecise instrument, right? You could be using something that, let's say, is in the, it's in increments of 100 or something like that, right? And so I don't want to confuse you too much about that because we have to talk some about significant figures. But that would be a properly recorded number. That would be a properly recorded number. If you smoke some doobie, maybe even 18, right? Maybe 18 would technically be, I couldn't fault you for using the measurement device incorrectly. I just think that maybe you weren't looking too closely. So hope that helps a little bit. I do have the PowerPoint, and the beginning of the PowerPoint kind of lists off some of these like rule of ones, rule of tens, rules of twos and fives that we just talked about. For the accuracy and precision one, we're going to switch to the PowerPoint. Just that one should be relatively quick. And then the significant figures discussion, I've actually decided to split that kind of into two, because one is going to be us talking about the actual rules for counting significant figures. And also we're going to learn some rules for calculating, and then I'll have another video that's kind of like this where I'm standing at the board showing you how to actually do some of the problems from your lab. Okay, see you soon. Okay, I might have lied. There's one more example that I wanted to do for you. It actually is from your part one of the lab, and it's just one that a lot of people screw up that I had forgotten about. So what you should see is some sort of pressure measurement down here with a dial. And one of the things you'll notice is that the increment for that particular dial is in 50s, right? Each mark goes up by 50. Smallest mark, that is. And I think that's in kPa, kilopascals. Don't worry too much about the unit right now. So that means that I'm in the rules of fives, right? Or rules of twos and fives. So whatever measurement that I record has to stop at the 10th place. The other number is only allowed to be a 0, and certainly no decimals, right? And so when I look at that thing, which I'm trying to see right now, but I'm too old to see in my computer screen, it looks to me that it's certainly less than 450, and it's certainly more than 400. So a properly reported value for that particular one might be something like this, 420 kilopascals. So you should notice that that is actually the estimated digit. This is the last real known digit. So whatever we record, right, we could have recorded 420 kilopascals, even maybe 430, but you can't have any digit right here other than a 0 because that would indicate too much precision. So hopefully that helps you guys out. Usually with these kinds of measurements, people need a lot of help. So please feel free to ask me any kind of questions. If you take like a screenshot of what you're trying to measure, I can certainly help you out a little bit more.